IELTS teachers are not born, they're made, and there have been many times when I've had a aha moment and thought, I never knew that before. So I'm going to talk about a few things that I think you should know from the get-go. Something important you might need to know if you're a new teacher and teaching IELTS for the first time is the fact that there are different versions of the exam. You have the academic IELTS, you also have the general IELTS. Both exams are graded in exactly the same way. It's from band 0 to band 9 and all those sorts of things. But the actual content of the test is slightly different in different ways. So the reading paper is a little bit different for the general compared to the academic IELTS paper, as is task 1 of the writing paper. In task 1 for general IELTS, they're going to have to write a letter of some sort. Whereas in the academic version of the test, they have data which they have to interpret and write about. Something else your students might ask you about is something called UKVI. Now, this is exactly the same as IELTS. The only difference is it's connected to the UK and being able to go there to study or to become a migrant worker to go to the UK. And basically what they do is they've set up certain institutions which they recognise as test centres. And if you want to go to the UK, you need to make sure that you take an exam in one of those centres. The UKVI is exactly the same in terms of offering an academic or general exam. It's graded in exactly the same as a regular IELTS exam. The only difference really is the fact that your exam results paper is slightly different, and it shows where you took the exam and that it's recognised by this system. So if your students are asking you about that and they're not planning to go to the UK, they probably don't need to go for UKVI, they can just go for the regular exam. So the marking system for the IELTS is a little bit different depending whether you're looking at listening and reading or speaking and writing. So with the listening and reading, it's a pure point-based system. If you get the question right, you get a point. If you get the question wrong, you get no points. And the more points out of 40 you get, the higher your band score is. And you can have a look on the screen and see how it slightly varies depending on if it's the listening or reading or academic or general. The productive skills are actually marked in a slightly different way. And you'll notice that both speaking and writing have 4 different criteria in the way that they're graded. And you can actually get access to these documents. They're called the public band descriptors, and they're split into different things. So writing, for example, you're based on your task achievement or your task response, depending on whether or not the student has answered the entire task and done it well. There's also the coherence and cohesion, whether or not the examiner can easily understand the ideas that are linked together and if it all flows nicely. Then of course you've got vocabulary and grammar. We see the same 2 things, vocabulary and grammar, in the speaking grading, but we also see fluency and coherence, which is basically how willing is the student to talk at length, and is it easy to follow what they're saying. And then also we have pronunciation, which are those key skills, including things like word stress, intonation, and so on, that really make English sound the way that it does. So being as familiar as you can with the grading criteria for the productive skills is really going to make you a better teacher. And if you look at them, they're kind of self-explanatory. Another thing to know about is follow-up questions. Now, I didn't know about follow-up questions for about a year into my career as an IELTS teacher. And when I figured them out, it really made sense. So this is actually an issue that many IELTS teachers have, is they never actually take the exam themselves, so they don't know exactly what it looks like from the inside. So if you're ever in a situation where you can take the entire IELTS exam, including a speaking test, whether or not it's a mock test, really do jump at it because it's going to make you a better teacher. So follow-up questions are to be found in the 3rd part of the speaking test. The one that's a little bit more abstract, where the questions are a little bit more unfamiliar for the student. In this part, the examiner is going to be really testing the boundaries of the candidate, and they're going to ask these follow-up questions based on what the student says. And this can often wrong foot a student because they've been preparing for these kind of set answers they found on the internet, and then suddenly the examiner turns it on its head. So if you want to be the best IELTS teacher you can, make sure you include this follow-up question element in your speaking tests. And if you want to see what it looks like in action, you can check out my other YouTube channel, the IELTS Grind, and I do a weekly mock speaking test, a live stream on Friday nights, and I really do try and push the students, especially in part 3. You can find a link to that somewhere at the top. So talking about questions and the speaking exam, something you should know and should definitely teach your students is that they can ask the examiner questions during the exam, but only certain questions and at certain times. So in part 1 of speaking, the rules are a little bit more rigid. So the examiner has a certain set of questions on different topics, and they can only really ask those questions. If a student wants them to repeat one, they can repeat the question, but only in exactly the way that it's written. But in part 3, the examiner is not actually given a set list of questions. They're more given kind of prompts, and they have to make questions from those prompts themselves, which means every exam is slightly different. So that's why you should discourage your students from trying to get lists of past exam questions from the internet. But in part 3, the student can actually ask 3 different types of questions. They can ask the examiner to repeat the question if they didn't hear it. They can ask the examiner to rephrase the question if they don't quite understand the format of the question, and they can also ask the examiner to explain a particular word if they don't understand that word. But it's always best for the student to ask the right question for what they want. So if they haven't heard the question, then they shouldn't ask them to rephrase it. Just ask them to repeat the question. So if we talk about writing and task 1 in the academic paper, there's a really good kind of phrase that my colleague Michael came up with from the IELTS Grind. I can't claim this is mine, but I steal it because it's so good. There are 3 big no's when it comes to task 1 in the academic paper. And it's all about what you should and shouldn't do when you're writing a response to this task. No I, no why, and no conclusion. It is a really good saying, and I wish I had come up with it myself. So basically what we're saying here is no I means you don't give any opinions in task 1 writing. So discourage your students from giving their opinion or using pronouns such as I or you or we. We can also say this is basically no thesis. We do want a thesis in task 2, but we never want a thesis in task 1. Also no why, meaning the student doesn't have to explain why the data happened or what led to the data happening. They're just reporting what they see on paper and that's it. So they don't need to explain it. And no conclusion is basically no conclusion. That's right, no conclusions because there's no thesis. We don't want to include a conclusion in task 1, but it's something that many students think they have to do. So try to cure them of that habit quite early on. When the students come to take the actual exam, they have 2 different options of how to do it, the paper-based system or the computer-based system. Now, there is absolutely no difference in the difficulty of the exam. It's exactly the same exam, but many students seem to think that one is easier than the other. So I think most people would say the biggest difference comes when you're doing the writing paper and the reading paper. When you're writing by hand, if you're not very good at it or you're not used to it, you've not got very good handwriting, then the computer-based system might be better for you. I mean, personally, my writing is terrible, so I'd much rather type. And the same thing can be said for the reading paper. Some people find it easier to work with a paper-based text where they can underline things and quickly jump between the questions and the reading, whereas other people might prefer using the computer to read things. It's just a preference thing. So when talking about it in class, just make that clear. There's no difference in the difficulty. It's just a personal perception of difficulty using either a pen or using a keyboard. When it comes to the guys that oversee the IELTS exam, there are 2 big players in the market, the British Council and IDP. Now, IDP is kind of based out of Australia and the British Council, I assume, is based out of the United Kingdom. But again, there's no difference in the service that they provide. The exams are exactly the same difficulty. It really depends in which country you live and which of those 2 organisers actually organise the exam. So for example, in India recently, IDP bought all the rights to British Council and they are going to be running the exam almost exclusively from India. But here in Taiwan, we have both the British Council and IDP operating, and they provide exactly the same exam. So basically, you can tell your students there's no difference. So talking about writing, again, another little fun fact for you guys out there in IELTS land is the fact that there is task 1 and task 2. There are 2 things that you have to do regardless of whether you're taking the general or the academic exam. But task 2 is actually worth more than task 1. So it's worth twice as many points, as it were. So when they calculate the writing score, they add the task 1 result and they times the task 2 result by 2, add it all together and divide it by 3, which gives you the overall writing band score. Now you might think, right, if I only had an hour, I'd dedicate a lot more time to task 2. That's also a good strategy, but you've got to tell your students that they must complete both tasks. They must attempt both tasks at least. They could not get a grade if they only did task 2. They also have to attempt task 1. Those tricky IELTS examiners. When it comes to giving your students a grade, especially for the speaking and the writing, remember that when you're marking it, you can't give a half band score. For example, if you're working on task achievement for task 1 writing, you could not give the student a 6.5. You would either have to give them a band 5 or band 6 for that particular area. Then you would add up all the other scores that you've given, so task achievement, you'd add up your coherence and cohesion, your lexical resource and your grammatical range and accuracy, divide them by 4, and that would give you the overall band score. But what do they do when they don't get a full band score? The other thing to know is if you don't get a whole band score, like a 5, 6, 7, or half band score, 5.5, 6.5, 7.5, what they do is they round up to the nearest full band score or half band score. So if, for example, you got 6.785, that would be a band 7. And if you want to know how to grade IELTS essays better, then check out this video here, where I talk about all the things that you're probably not doing right and some things that you can do to help your students improve even more. Catch you later.